Hello, everyone. Welcome to Treasure Hunt. Today, we are excited to host a fireside chat with Grant Din and Felicia Lowe about how to dig for family stories at home. Both of you, Grant, Felicia, you are descendants of what's called paper families, where your ancestors entered the United States in spite of the Chinese Exclusion Act, using identities, right, from Chinese Americans with birthright citizenship. And so you've both been on journeys to peel back, many layers of secrets, silence, shame around your family history. So what initially sparked your curiosity to dig into your past? And when did you realize you had stumbled into some buried skeletons in the treasure chest? We can start with Felicia and then go to Grant.
I think early on in my life, I realized after asking my mother many questions about her past or about her childhood, or who was Uncle Cam and who was her sister who had a different name. And those questions were generally ignored. And, after a while, a child learns that if they're not going to answer, then that must mean you better stop asking the questions. So I would say that quite early on, I was programmed to not ask the questions. And it was many years later that I realized it had made me a very curious child. And so I chose a field, study journalism, in which people would have to answer my questions. And I have to say that it was the absence of answers that propelled me to, as I was older, to appreciate that there were a lot of things I wanted to know about my family's past. And that was what started it. And I would say the impetus actually was the birth of my child, because he was 3 months old when my father died. And I realized at that time that I had very little to tell him about his grandfather. That began my journey and became my first documentary film called China, Land of My Father, where I went to China and met my father's mother and his family for the first time. I'll throw it to Grant to answer that early question, because we're going to be going back and forth on this issue.
Yeah, we have a pretty unusual name. Chinese people always ask, what is din? Is it ding or what? And it turns out it's really gong. So where's the origin of this? I didn't know so much about paper sons and everything until I got older. Started thinking about how my grandfather came to this country with this other identity. And his paper name is actually Ao Lun. And then his brother came over as Dun Ho, which got turned around to Hugh Din. And my grandfather's brother brought my grandfather's wife over as his wife. So it's really, really complicated. And the things that people had to do to come to this country, to start a family, and so on.
How did you find out that you were not Din, that you were really a Gong? How did you find out that piece of information?
Oh, my father died when I was only 2. And so I didn't know that much about the Din side until I got older and started asking my uncles and aunts about that. People said, oh, yeah, we're really Gongs. And then we have the Zupu of the Gong family, and, a branch of our...
You can explain what the Zupu is for those who may not.
Oh, okay. Thanks. It's a family tree, basically, and many Chinese Zupu or Jiapu go back hundreds of years. And I found out at a family gathering that I was in the 36th generation of Gongs. And so it's like, whoa, that's amazing that we can track how we're connected to a lot of other Gongs.
I wonder if you can put up, Chrislyn, the certificate of identities of my parents.
Sounds good.
Let me just explain something, because these certificate of identities are the false papers that my parents came to this country on. You'll see my mother's name is Kam Saw Kwan. My father's name is Ju Wing Sun. It was based on these documents that I was able to ask the National Archives to help me find their actual file. It was through the files that I began to unlock some of the questions I had about my parents. My dad was always called Samgaw, third brother. It was very curious to me because when I went to China, I knew that he was the firstborn. So he would not be third brother. He would be Aigo or something. He'd be the first one. But according to the documentation, he was third son of my grandfather's first wife. And in fact, he was the first son of the second wife. So this is how you begin to break down some of the information that helped me begin to get the larger picture of where the name Zhu Wing Sun came. His real Chinese name was Lo Wing Sun, so they kept the Wing Sun, but the Jew part came because on his document it says he's the son of a native. And I was able to get the file of my grandfather. And in fact, Bill Green, who was one of the researchers and staff at the National Archives who helped me find the folder and files of my grandfather and father, read the documentation of my grandfather, and it said he was born in the Gold Country. He read it and he said, I think your grandfather really was born here. So it was so convincing, the stories that they had created about his backstory, that it justified him identifying that he had a number of sons who were then going to be coming to America. My father came as that third son. On my mother's side was a very different story, but I will tell that story a little later because I'm going to toss it to Grant to talk about how you find documentation.
Yeah, the certificates of identity open up the door to finding the files at the archives. If you don't have those, there are duplicates at the archives that you can look up also. But when my aunt and mother pulled out the certificates from my grandfather and grandmother, I was amazed because it still is intact. And those led us to the archives. And it turns out I had thought that his first appearance in the U.S. was in 1919, because that's what the certificate said. But when we went to the National Archives, we found that he actually came in 1905, stayed in the U.S. for a while, and then went back in 1916 to get married. And then he came back through Angel Island in 1919. So if you can find the file, it'll lead to a lot more information, ideally other journeys possibly.
What are some of the other documents or ways in which people can identify or begin their paper search anyway?
The ship manifests are very helpful because the file numbers are based on the number of the ship, the page of the manifest, and then the line number. So all those things altogether make the case file number, and that will usually appear on the certificate of identity. And so even if you don't know all the information, if you tell the folks at the archives what ship they're on, if you're able to find that on Family Search or Ancestry or somewhere like that, then that can lead to helping find the file. Now, if they later became a citizen, that file will probably become what's called an A file, and then it will be in a different location.
What we've been talking about so far are people who came during exclusion. How about people who are trying to find information after exclusion was repealed?
There's still some files from the 40s and 50s into the 60s, but there probably aren't as many at the archives. You might be able to find naturalization papers and things like that, but because of exclusion being repealed, there wasn't the paper trail that you might find so much. My uncle was actually, I think he came in the 40s after exclusion, but he might have still had a paper name because my aunt would refuse to tell her son anything about his father's immigration status. She was very, very closed about talking about anything about that. So my cousin was unable to find out much. And then we were able to find his immigration file, and he understood a lot better why his mother was not wanting to say anything because, he was a paper son, probably after exclusion.
the whole point of the secrecy was something I didn't understand as a child. And then as I began to dig into the bigger story, I understood why my family was so secretive, as your aunt was, about the past. One thing, I think they were terrified of the government, that even though they had children who were born here, if any of the secret leaked out, we could all be deported. I think there was really a genuine fear of being discovered. So
Right.
the less we knew, the better. That was probably a major piece of it. And the way that story broke about finding my mother's story was this photograph of my mother as an infant standing next to her sister. It was this photo that had been in my house and displayed in my home forever. And it took my daughter, who had a homework assignment, to ask her grandmother, why was that picture taken? A question I'd never asked my mother. I don't know if she would have answered, but when my daughter asked her that question, she told my daughter it was for my father, who left for Cuba before I was born. I have to say that when my daughter told that story to me, recounted that, she came running down the stairs. She said, Mom, did you know that? Did you know the story? I was flabbergasted. What? Chinese in Cuba? You know, that alone threw me off guard. But also the fact that in that moment when she said her father had left before she was born and she did not meet him till she was a teenager, told me a whole lot about my mother. She had felt that she had been abandoned. You know, so it was one of these unexpected factoids that broke open a lot of information. And I, a few years' time, ended up going to Cuba to see what I could learn about that grandfather. And why were the Chinese in Cuba? What caused that diaspora towards there? And it had something to do with exclusion. Simply because it was easier to get to other countries that did not have exclusion laws. And Cuba at one time during World War I had a labor shortage. So they opened up their gates. And my family came from the Jungsan area. Many people from Jungsan and Toisan went there to work. When I went to Cuba, of course, thinking like, had he been there for 15 years, I wonder if he started another family. I wonder what he did while he was there. I really was hungry to learn about his life in Cuba. And I was only moderately successful because the records in Cuba after their revolution was a mess. And also another thing about Chinese is that you can have several names. I mean, your name can change. If you're a man, this is true. So you might have a name when you were born. And then when you went to school, you may be given another name. Then when you married, they might give you another name to be called by. So I had one name for my grandfather. So I went to the family name organizations and the district organizations with the name that I had, but who knows what name he might have been operating under. And speaking of names, what is often missing? Women's names. So it's really harder to find information about women because their names don't show up, not in the Zipu at all. They're just not acknowledged. So I just, taking that photo is really one of the things I wanted to talk about. In lieu of documentation, what you do have and what you should try to look for and scrounge up are photos, family photos, anything you can lay your hands on. Maybe there's a memento or a precious piece of statue that your family holds dear, to try to get some other items that can maybe trip a memory or a conversation, begin piecing together what information you can get. And really, when you think about interviewing, quote interviewing, what I tell young people is if you have a grandparent, say you have to do homework, they would be more than happy to help you under those circumstances most of the time. And that was the ruse, but it happened to be true with my daughter. This was part of a homework assignment. When she went to college, she happened to continue her interest in her grandmother's story. She actually interviewed my mother again, she said it was for a class, women's studies. And so she put together actually an incredibly beautiful album of my mother, for my mother, about her story. But she had also audio taped my mother's interview. And if some of you have seen Chinese couplets, I used her interviews. She miraculously was able to find them, and I used them as a sound source so that some of my mother's story are told in her own words. Very little of her before she became my mother. And that was the journey I was on. How did she get to America? And who was she before she became my mother? Those were the questions I was seeking to find answers for. And it was actually by looking at the transcript of my aunt, who had come to America a few years earlier than my mother, because she came here as a bride. My grandmother had arranged a marriage for her older daughter, who was at that time 18 years old. And it was reading my aunt's transcripts, I was able to learn something about my mother's life as she was growing up in the village that she grew up in with her mother and sister.
Felicia, was Alana pretty close with your mom? I mean,
Yeah.
not from the beginning. Yeah, that's okay. So she was quite willing to open up to her, whereas she might not have told you some things.
She absolutely told me nothing.
Now, that's really interesting.
Well, I think, I'm sure that some of it was that she was more relaxed after so many years. That was part of it.
Uh-huh.
Just the tension, I think, that she held and withheld, was maybe partly still part of what we had all, the three of us, talked about was, the silence was sometimes from shame and sometimes it was fear, the secrecy. And I think that what I can see now that I have discovered some of these things that are behind me is that, there have been consequences for that, intergenerational shame, intergenerational trauma. Because, with the paper names came a certain kind of perception about, well, I should say not the paper names as much as Chinese Exclusion Act.
Right.
The act in and of itself said, America doesn't want you. We don't want you here. It was the only time that a race was identified as being unwanted in this country. And the workaround that people took to be able to come here meant people were quite desperate to come, because the consequences always was that you would be sent back, which is another story. But the paper names was a result of trying to do a workaround, because the restrictions on the Exclusion Act only allowed teachers, merchants, students, and minor age children of those groups to enter the country. And China, for most of that time, was 95% agrarian. They were mostly laborers. So it was a very small percentage of people who could legitimately come to this country.
Yeah. Your mother had a really amazing story of how her mother was able to get her passage to right?
My grandmother, understand, and to be reminded again, was basically a single mom with two daughters. The Chinese culture was such that the idea is to get your sons out of the country because maybe they could find a job and then they could send money home. So, I see my grandmother as being quite bold in her attempt to just figure out how could she get her two daughters safety. And safety meant getting them out of the country, because in the 20s and 30s and beyond actually was a very tumultuous time. There was always the fear of Japan invading China. There was civil war. There were droughts. It was a very horrible, difficult time. And so my aunt, as I mentioned earlier, had an arranged marriage. My grandmother had a friend whose son had returned from America looking for a wife. And it so happened that the arrangement worked out. They got married and they left just before Japan invaded Manchuria. And what that meant, though, was that once that happened, my grandmother and all the Chinese knew that the Japanese were going to continue their onslaught and travel south. So my grandmother was always trying to think about a way of getting my mother out of the country. And she was 5 years younger, so she couldn't arrange a marriage. What she did do, and what was really a story you can't even make up, is that she heard about a family who was leaving to return to Hawaii, which was a protectorate. So it was okay for them to go to Hawaii. In that family was a daughter who was about my mother's age who had died. So my grandmother went to this family in a nearby village. She met with the family and she asked them if they would take her own daughter in the place of her dead daughter. She would assume the identity of that dead daughter and travel with the family back to Hawaii. That's how she became Kamsaw Kwan. Like I said, if I wrote this in a script, people would say, that's outrageous. Nothing like that could happen. But that's what happened. That's how my mother got out of China. I think it just indicates how desperate people were. I mean, it probably cost her every penny she ever had. It really required the cooperation of this other family who's, had just lost a child. And even when we say they took her in, that meant that they also had to endure interrogation once they arrived or landed wherever they were. If it was in the States, it was at Angel Island Immigration Station. In Hawaii, there was still interrogations that took place because INS at that time really didn't know about the paper arrangements. So they were interrogating people to make sure that the sons or the daughters who came were really genuinely those sons and daughters. The last picture that they had of Kamsaw Kwan was when she was infant. She was 2 years old. So, of course it could have been my mother. I mean, they looked close enough. There was no way to really challenge that. But she was interrogated, and maybe some of you already know about the coaching papers. Grant, maybe you can talk about that.
Sure. People, when they bought an identity, would buy the entire biography of that person they were buying. Say, well, this is my story. This is the village we're from. These are the people who live there, because immigration officials asked people to go into extreme detail about their houses, their villages, who lived in the third house of the fourth row of the village, what kind of feet does his wife have? Because sometimes they were women with bound feet, unfortunately. Things like that. And so to prepare for that, people would have these really long coaching books, and they would have to study. Kids would quit school just to study. The officials would keep a map, compare the specific villages with other people from that village. So it just was incredibly difficult to come over. Sometimes if they were denied entry, scheduled to be deported, they would appeal their case. And often it would go all the way to Washington, D.C. And sometimes they get the report back from D.C. and they say, there's no way that anyone could know all these things. It seems like the person is who he says he is.
You can imagine, having gone through all of that, how you would keep your head down. There was no reason for them to call attention to themselves. Not only did they have the shadow of exclusion already on you as a Chinese person, but also to have experienced the kind of treatment that people experience going through the interrogation. They had pretty invasive medical examinations. It was Angel Island Immigration Station, and was designed to keep people out. Not like Ellis Island, which was designed to welcome people, and people were in and out in, a matter of hours. At Angel Island, they were there for weeks, months, and in rare occasions, even years. So that left an imprint. I mean, even to the extent that Chinese called the policemen look yi, green uniforms. And that's what the immigration officials wore at Angel Island. Whereas, on the streets, they wore blue uniforms. So there was a deep impression that was made. And, Grant and I have both been very involved with the preservation of Angel Island for this very simple reason. It really symbolizes the complexity of immigration treatment of various peoples. And we're sadly seeing a repeat performance today with different groups.
Yeah.
Felicia, given that your daughter was the one that kind of warmed up, your mom to share more of her story, like at what point did some of these artifacts, these concrete traces of her past, like start to light? Was it all through your daughter? Like, when did your mom start to warm up to share to you?
Well, I went to Cuba to, as I mentioned earlier, to see if I could find any information about my grandfather. And I came up with very little information specifically about him, but I did meet a man and interviewed a guy who immigrated or went to Cuba the same year that my grandfather did and was still living there. Lee Choi, who was, his Cuban name was Raphael Lee. He was then in his 80s, and he told me about his life, how difficult it was, because he didn't speak Spanish. He could only do labor work. And he said, like, if you don't have money, women don't want you. And he lived a very barren, kind of sad life. I mean, he would call it that. I'm not judging it, as he kind of expressed it himself. And so when I returned, I told my mother about the trip. And if you get a chance to see the film, when I told my mother I was going to Cuba, she left a message on my phone machine. And at that time, there were those little mini cassettes. And she left a very emotional message to me. She said, if you go to Cuba, that's fine, but just leave me out of it. He abandoned us, and I don't care what he did, but I don't care about him. And so, just go, but leave my story out of this. She was angry and she was hurt and she was many things. And I just had never heard my mother so emotional in that sense before. So I happened to pull that tape out of the machine, and it's in my film because it really did give you a lot of information, even in her tonality in terms of how she spoke about him. But when I came back and I told her about Lee Choi, I showed her the film. I said, Mom, maybe the reason why he didn't send money back was that he didn't have any money. It wasn't like her impression was that he had been drinking and gambling and having a great old time, and that's why he didn't send money back. Here was evidence that possibly he had no money to send back. I don't think she had ever considered that. And so I feel like that softened her a great deal. It made it possible for me to ask her some other questions and go deeper into some of the things I was interested in that had more to do with her journey to the country. So my way of saying, find out your allies and who can help you in finding out the stories, uncles and aunts, people who are not, sometimes, your parents and whatever tensions or non-tensions that may exist, they may just sometimes resist, but, it may be just less charged with other people who still know pieces of the story. And I think it very much is a constant issue of kind of collecting information, collecting pieces of a puzzle that you are going to try to piece together for a picture. And there will always be some missing pieces. You can draw a larger sense of family. I mean, if I could do it, you could do it, but it takes patience. And, at the end of the day, I have to say it takes patience, it takes persistence. And it's really a combination of what Grant is so good at, which is, what's the paper trail? What can you learn from the paper trail? So one thing I have to just say as a reminder about how you interview is, one, to build a rapport is the most important part of any interviewing you do with anyone. You can't just come in with a piece of paper and sit somebody down and start shooting questions at them.
Right.
Most people are not going to respond to that. And especially of a certain generation, they're even less willing to be receptive to that because the culture is such that privacy and keeping it to yourself and keeping it within the family is more the norm than not. Don't air dirty laundry. They may perceive it that way. You may perceive it in a very different way. And I think also when we say build rapport, find your props, whatever you can use. Maybe it's combing through old family picture albums and pulling out pictures and asking about who are the people in this picture? What were you doing at that time? when you were my age, what were you doing then? Just questions about their lives, because oftentimes nobody had the luxury of thinking about what they were doing. They were just surviving. So sometimes, it is appreciated when you take the time to just ask the questions of, think back to when you were a kid or when you were a teenager. My mother was on a boat with a strange family posing as their daughter. That's what I was doing. But in my mother's lifetime, she ended up having 6 different names. And that was one of the ways in which I kind of learned about her life. When did she get this name? Why did she get the name Letty, which was a name that was given to her? She went to high school when she arrived. And so she was, a teacher gave her that name Letty. One of the pieces that always gets a good laugh is when I say, well, why did she name you Letty? And my mother says, I don't know. That was so long ago. You're asking me these goddamn questions. Leave me alone or something. So, the things that are important to us may measure and have a different feeling for them, but you can't be discouraged by it. But you have to kind of, read the room, read how they're responding, and maybe you just leave it and then come back to it another time and approach it in a different way. But the key thing about interviewing is really to listen. Listen hard and listen carefully. And don't be shy to find ways of asking a question 6 different ways. Maybe one of those ways will get you the answer that you seek.
When you interviewed Angel Island immigrants for your story that was aired at the immigration station for a long time, did you have a hard time getting them to talk about
Absolutely. Absolutely. Grant's referring to a film I made called Carved in Silence, which was made in 1988. And the good news about that was that we really found people who were adults who came there as adults, had been there for 6 months, 10 months, and almost 2 years. And they really knew what it was like being there. They could talk about how they got there, who bought them their papers, their whole process. And even though they could speak English, they were much more comfortable speaking Chinese. And many of you may know the name Judy Young, who is a historian who's not with us anymore. She's fluent in Chinese.
Right, she was.
I can understand more than I can speak, but I cannot conduct an interview. So Judy conducted the first set of interviews with these folks. I listened to them and they were very, like 1-word answers. Yes, no. And I talked to Judy afterwards. They were not usable, in fact. Because I didn't get any information. And it's very intimidating when you have a camera pointed at you with 3 people with lights pointed at you. And,
Right.
Just the scene itself of setting up to shoot an interview is intimidating enough. Then to ask these hard questions. So we did a second set of interviews. We had to do a second set of interviews. And Judy and I talked about it. And I said, I think we have to be much more aggressive in our response and how we interviewed them. Because we were the good Chinese daughters, we didn't want to rustle their feathers. But so I said, okay, this time going in, let's say, weren't you mad when they did this and that? And that opened up the ability for them to feel freer to talk or, engage them in a different way. And that was really helpful to understand who you're talking to and what are the ways in which you would approach them to maybe get more answers to your question. But that's why I said, think about 6 different ways you can ask a question. Because one would elicit, a yes or no answer, and maybe another way of asking it would help them say, oh, yeah, that did happen, or something like this,
Yeah, that was really powerful to see that. Chinese couplets, you mentioned that it was kind of like a follow-up much later to China Land of My Father. Did you find out a lot that you didn't expect to find?
One thing that allowed me, I think, to make Chinese couplets was that I had, so many years had passed since I made China Land of My Father. And part of it had to do with my own kind of accumulation of knowledge about Angel Island and about the process of what people had to do to get here. and also why people were so desperate to leave.
Right.
And maybe if you put up the wind chime, that was one of the symbolic images I created for the film Chinese couplets. And the reason why I selected a wind chime is that I realized that it was the desperation of getting people out of China had to do with the conditions at that time. You know, for my grandmother, she wanted her daughters to be out of harm's way. And so I use the wind chime as a symbol of how the winds have changed. You know, outer circumstances create and force different kinds of decisions or influence your decisions. So that for her, you know, the war was going on, her husband was away, she felt like she was the only person to save her daughters. And so, you know, she chose that. But in every situation, like for my mother, she realized her mother was had made the sacrifice for her. So how did that decision influence her life? Well, for my mother, who, you know, experienced what it was like to really be poor and desperate and to live in a village, in Chinese villages, small communities, everybody knows your business. And I think that she lived with a lot of shame because they knew that the father wasn't sending money home. Mm-hmm. So what did that mean for her? Well, you know, I think that her reaction was when she got here, she was going to be financially secure, and she worked very hard to become a very successful businesswoman. Then after being widowed for a number of years, she married a second time to somebody who was quite wealthy. But I think that she was quite driven by her past. And I have to say that I had a lot more compassion towards my mother as a person in her 60s at that time when I made the film than I did when I was 30. Like a bird's eye view, looking down and seeing the broader picture of what was going on in the places in China that would spur my grandmother to want her daughters out of there. What would spur my grandfather to leave China and try to make a living somewhere else? You know, what created all of this turmoil? Some of it had to do with the Chinese Exclusion Act, you know? So, you know, I have just such an appreciation for the courage it took, you know, to really come to this country that didn't want you in the first place. So for all of us here, you know, we have deep gratitude for all the people who were willing to sacrifice on our behalf.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, my grandmother's interrogations, and they asked her every little thing in the book. And then they said, what's written on the gate at the front of the village? She goes, well, there's something there, but I can't read. You know, so she was never taught how to read. Packing up everything, going to this new country is so brave.
I wanted to mention the actions that are taking place now around people crossing the border, the southern border, and families being separated, and, you know, children being separated from their parents. You know, it's just heartbreaking. And I noticed that there are a number of groups that are really coming to their aid, like Suru for Solidarity.
Right.
Many of these are people who were interned or in concentration camps, so the Japanese Americans, and they've been going to some of these sites where these kids are locked up in cages to say, you know, we're not going to stay silent. We went through that. You know, we need to support one another. We need voices to people to hear what's going on, you know. And I think that we as a community need to not only share this history of exclusion of the Chinese, but that we have this opportunity. You know, I love what Reverend Martin Luther King had said, you know, we may have all come on different boats, but we're all in the same boat now.
Yeah.
Show some solidarity for other groups who have been targeted as we have been in our past. You know, there are some who say, well, that doesn't relate to me. I came in 1965, you know, that's old history. It doesn't matter, you know, didn't affect us. But I would really challenge anybody who thinks that, you know, yes, if you have education and you have money, it'll protect you to some level. It doesn't erase the fact that you are a person of color. And we didn't see this over 300% increase in anti-Asian hate. It didn't just start yesterday.
That's right.
Yeah, I suspect there must be some questions.
Yeah. Thank you both for sharing this wisdom, just connecting the patterns that you've seen on the personal level of your family and to see these stories happening again and again. And just really appreciate you being real about the reality that not every puzzle piece may come to light, right? But it's still worth the search. And, what are ways we can lead with our curiosity and our heart, and that the sharing of the story, however many holes there may be, can be healing.
Chrislyn, I wonder if you would post that last picture I had, what I call the bad statue, because this is a listing of all the laws. There were 15 additional laws after the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 was passed. This is a listing of 15 additional things to extend the time of it, to make each one more harsh, so that at one point, a woman who was married to a Chinese would lose her citizenship if she married a Chinese guy. There were just arcane things to really keep people from not even being able to start families, And when you think about the consequences of these laws that cast such a long shadow, what that meant until 1943 when they repealed the law. Could servicemen then be allowed to marry, can start families? The exclusion delayed our acculturation in America. We've been playing catch up ever since. Even then, there are just new ways in which the racism and discrimination has, is just like under the surface that can rear its head again. So, from that standpoint, I think it forces us all to really take a deep look into what we can do to not be the model minority and not say anything, but to speak up. I think we have skin in the game.
Just to build off that, right? Like speaking up starts with knowing, right? Like what are your questions, right? What is your story to share that gives you a rightful place at this table in this community? And so if there are any of you who are here who are feeling like, all right, you're telling me, right, there's a lot of puzzle pieces, but you're not sure, is it enough? Or, what do I do with it? There is a free resource that I want to drop in the chat. You can actually connect like one-to-one with any of our researchers at My China Roots, and they'll give you a completely free assessment of all the family history information you already have, as well as like what else you might have access to, what steps can you take next with the information you have. It's a lot of information to try to piece through on your own. And so I encourage you to, reach out for that personal kind of sounding board to gain more clarity. Our door is open if you want to reach out at any time.
I mean, that's amazing that My China Roots offers that service to you folks who are interested in pursuing your own investigation.
Yeah. So at this time, we had to open the floor audience Q&A if any of you here want to ask a live question. And there was a question that came up last night during the pre-event screening. Do either of you have any sense of like what percentage of descendants, at least like Chinese American descendants, have paper families or like paper ancestors?
I don't. You, Grant?
I'd say most. I don't know. It's really hard to say because, people did come as merchants and so on, but I don't think those numbers were as
well,
great.
They weren't very large. Right?
Yeah, they weren't very large. Exactly. I don't have an exact number, but it's pretty high.
Yeah. One thing to also mention is that what was the legacy of that? Like, did you have to live with that name for the rest of your life? Or the machinations people had to do so that, like Bill Wong, for example, a friend of mine, he was a journalist, his mother had to come as the sister of father, even though she was really married to him. Right. I mean, they're like all these convoluted things. Didn't you have a family situation like that, Grant?
Yes. My grandfather's papers came when he was like 17 as a young man, as a single man. And so when he was going to get married, his brother brought his wife over, but she was really my grandfather's wife. They even all lived together for a while, and he and his wife had a different address, just in case anyone would show up and check. And then later, his brother died, and he started using his brother's name because then he'd be legitimately married to his own wife. But in 1940, he went back to his real paper name. His original paper name. So it's very strict. I guess he thought there's a government official. Maybe he better use his official government name.
His real fake name?
His real fake name. Yeah, his first fake name.
He had what was called the confession program.
Right.
If you fessed up, you could reclaim your name.
Yeah.
Very few people took advantage of that because, this was made like a house of cards. If you fessed up, then it would jeopardize everyone else that was related to you on that paper connection.
That's right.
My father reclaimed his name in a unique way in the sense that he went to the courts and he changed it, saying that for business reasons, he wanted to use the name Lowe because he owned a restaurant at that moment called Lowe's Cafe. They bought it, but it was really for him to reclaim his real last name. Looks like David has a question.
Question for Grant from David. Have you or anyone else the idea of changing, quote unquote, correcting your surname from Din to Gong?
Yeah, that's a good point. I had thought about using it as part of my name, like Grant Gong Din or Din Gong, but it's kind of hard to say. My cousin Howard Din changed it to Gong. So we have some people in the family that have done that. I think if I had done it much earlier, it would have made more sense. Yeah, but that's a good question, Dave, because I know a lot of people have done that, especially, do so much genealogy work. It would be good to use my real name.
That's why I use that term, what's your real name? Because in Chinatown, you'd meet somebody and they would say, but what's your real name?
Yeah, exactly.
It was a secret that was kept, or it was so generally accepted that everybody came on papers. They would say, but what's your real name?
Yeah.
Instead of where you're really from.
Right.
We have a question from AK for both of you to answer. How has researching family history impacted your present family dynamic?
I can say that it's really created these wonderful bonds. I have a cousin who is also an avid genealogist, and she's found a lot of information. I've been looking for research on my great-great-grandfather, who's in blue. He worked on the railroad, maybe the transcontinental, and then my cousin found an interview that her son had done with his grandmother, her mother, and found that he also worked in the gold mines. So it's really helped me get to know these other cousins that I didn't really grow up with. We've had a couple of reunions. We had one in person, had one online, which included a DNA cousin that I found. So it's like family research has really, improved the way our family has
interacted.
Yeah. It's been fun. And then I have a cousin who's a scrapbooker, and so she's very active doing this research. We interviewed her dad, a very young 92 now, and we actually had I think all three of his daughters and a couple of us all interviewed him at once. So that was fun. Yeah. How about you, Felicia?
Fair warning, not everybody in your family, even if you do the work, will be as interested as you are.
Right.
Frankly, for my family, I think they all appreciate kind of knowing it in a tangential way, but nobody's actually asked for a deep dive. I think many of them figure that, well, you've done it already, so what? For my daughter and I, it really was a team effort. I could not have done my film or gotten as much out of my mother had she not been a participant in it. So it was really a beautiful thing for us to share and work together with. And so now, what we do have can be passed down. It always felt like too much to be the first generation born here, that, I had no history behind me. And maybe my parents didn't have the words to say. They had the Chinese Exclusion Act. Maybe they didn't have the words to explain to me why they would be angry if I dated a guy who was Japanese American. Because my mother did not tell me that there had been a war and that Japan and China had a war. I didn't know these things until much later in my life. So from my standpoint, I've been deeply enriched by it. And when I found the information from the deep family historical records, the Zoo, how do you pronounce that? I always forget.
Zupu.
Yeah, exactly. So I found out I was the 26th generation on one side and the 25th on my father's side. That really enriched me, knowing that I come from this long, deep history, that I wasn't it didn't start here. It started long ago. And one of the things that I did include, because I've been asked to speak at a couple of citizenship swearing in ceremonies, was to say that, to thank those who decided to come on behalf of their children and their future children, that they were doing an act that is intended to provide a better life for their children. But I encourage them to not be shy to talk about their past, because we become enriched knowing about our history. And while I may not have understood that as a youngster or earlier, now in retrospect, I think that knowing your past doesn't hurt you.
Right.
If anything, I stood taller. So it's going to be immeasurable value for you if this is what you're interested in. If it can enrich your relatives who are interested, that's terrific. And if you have allies among them, as Grant has found among his cousins, all the better. The more the merrier in terms of helping in the research.
Absolutely. Yeah. I want to point out something. It's a fun article that was in the Woodland paper. It's Din family welcomes arrival of 11th child. It says, Mr. and Mrs. Hao Din of China Alley are parents of their 11th child born Monday. All 11 of the children are living. The two oldest who are born in China have never come to this country. I think those are paper slots. I think they claim to have children in China. And then the 9 little Dins, he mentions them. And I love this line. Mr. Din is proud of his thriving family, but he is vague about their names and ages. And
clear sign. There's something there.
Yeah.
That's a great title for a children's book, The 9 Little Dins.
Yeah.
Awesome. I know, Felicia, you've mentioned how upset and emotional your mom got in the process of all the questions you're asking. We have a question from Paula. Are there family members, your mom and beyond, right, who've become upset at you asking so many questions, and how did you respond and navigate that? Also, like a part 2 question I would throw into that is, especially like if you're trying to record any of this, right, and they don't want to be part of that, how do you navigate? Asking and then recording. Yeah.
The only real recordings we did were the ones that Alana recorded. And then I did some taping when, before my mother died, she went to China, to her village. It was her first time back. She had done a lot of traveling. She'd been to China. She'd been to the Great Wall, but she'd never gone back to her own village. So I did the shooting for that. I knew that it was too intimate for me to bring a camera person along. So I shot that. And it was really revealing to see my mother visiting her home village for the first time in some, 70s or 65 years. I mean, it'd been a long time. And the first night we arrived, she actually, we were in a hotel and we were in twin beds, and I just heard her sniffling. And I happened to have the camera with me, and I just turned it on. And I was asking her, I said, what's wrong, Mom? What are you upset? She said, well, I've just been thinking about my mom. And then when we went to the village and we walked to the house where she had lived, the location, and it was no longer the same house. Another house had been built in its place. So she didn't feel any connection to it. But when she walked around and her memory was being, refreshed about where the village temple was, when she went into the community center, all the people just welcomed her like a rock star, and they kept on asking her questions and, well, where was your house? And how old are you? And, she just didn't answer that question. She acted like she didn't hear them. But before she left, she had both her father and her mother's names carved on the village temple walls. My mother actually died within a year of that visit, and I eventually had her name carved on that temple wall. So that was the only kind of intimate filming that I did. And the question is, how did people respond to it? It took a long time to finish the film. It was the hardest script I've ever had to write because it was very complicated. It was really questioning how honest I could be about our relationship. I always mention the fact that my editor, who's Italian American, would really call me on the carpet. And he said, come on, what's really going on here? Tell the truth, tell the story the way it is. Because, of course, we have a way of wanting to make it sound nice or not uncomfortable. But there were many times that it was an uncomfortable journey because she had a right to her privacy, but I felt like I had a right to know about our past. So there was that struggle up front. I finished the film after my mother died. Those relatives who were alive were very grateful for the story because I uncovered a lot of information they didn't know. My first cousins, my aunt had 5 children. They were like my brothers and sisters. We grew up together. All of those cousins were quite grateful for the story because I had unlocked a lot of information. And even what I intend to do is that it's a specific story, but at the same time, there are a lot of similarities in all of our stories, those of us who are descendants of paper sons and paper daughters. That's why I was really trying to dissect and talk about what's your real name? What does that mean? How did it come about? What did that mean on the road? What were the ripple effects of having a paper name? And you lived with that name, and then your children maybe lived with that name. My birth certificate had my name as Felicia Choo. And then when my dad changed it in court, I became Felicia Lowe. That happened when I was 6 or 7. So then, finally understood what it was about, that my father really wanted to reclaim his name. It was a point of honor. So the name Lowe was hard won.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, as we come to the end of our time, are there any last words of encouragement or tips that you'd like to share?
Encouragement. Well, I think that if you have a drive to find out, you just go for it. But, you have to have patience. You have to be persistent, and you have to be imaginative and finding out different ways you might get information. I mean, in terms of, for me, it was not only specifically my family. What I was interested in also learning about was the circumstances of that time and where they came from. And of course, there are opportunities to really go back to those. Well, some of the villages still exist that your forebears lived in. And if you ever have that opportunity to go, I certainly encourage you to do that. Just so tactile to be in that space and to really feel the spirits of your ancestors in that space. It's really undescribable, really. But like I said, it centered me very much in understanding about my roots in China, having both been to my father's village and my mother's village. There are going to be some skeletons in the closet too. You may discover.
Like Felicia says, people might not open up to you right away, but sometimes if you get a couple aunties together or uncles and aunts together and kind of get the more outgoing one to start talking, other people might chime in. And, family gatherings are a good time to just kind of say, oh, what was it like when you were young? Just get them started.
Yeah, I even found that when I went to China, and I told you my first cousin was with me, I would ask her to ask my mother questions. Because sometimes my mother would automatically not answer me. So I'd ask her, I'd plant, she was my plant. Sometimes my mom would respond to her. So
yeah, that was a lesson of your film. It's like your daughter could get things out of your mom that no one else could.
Yes, so press on. Well, there's so many stories yet to uncover. And I just want to thank everyone for joining us, contributing your curiosity to this conversation. And just as we close, I'm sure for each of you here, there are questions and stories coming up for you personally. And so I just wanted to put on your radar and invite you to join this coming Monday evening. We'll be hosting a reflection chat. And this community talkback is, super casual. It's just for each of you to, listen, share more of your story, kind of process together as a community. Like, how can we apply these insights? And again, if you're interested in a free assessment of your puzzle pieces, sign up to connect with a researcher. So, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Grant. Thank you, Felicia. We look forward.
I think you guys are doing great work.
Yeah, thank you, Chrislyn.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.